and welcome to our video on the Form Creator. The Form Creator is a module under the Utilities menu that is a tool for administrators to create or modify the forms in the system. Staff members who are privileged to this area can use this tool to create and modify the majority of the documents in the WebGrants system. Before we start, I want to remind everyone watching this video that not all users should or will have access to the Form Creator. This access is given to people who will be utilizing the system utilities, and the majority of items under utilities affect the entire system. This is part 2 in the Form Creator video set. Today we'll cover the standard and very basic form creation. And if you haven't already, please watch the previous video on how to access and manage your existing forms in the Form Creator. There are 2 ways to create a brand new form. You can copy an existing form if you have one that's similar to what you're looking for, or you can create one brand new yourself. First, we're going to go over the easier option, and that's copying an existing form to create a brand new form. Sometimes this is actually harder because you end up having to do so many edits to that form to make it work that it would have been easier to just start from scratch. So if you are copying an existing form, make sure it's really similar to what you need. So I'm going to log in. The admin functionality is all in utilities, and it depends on what type of admin you are for what you see in your utilities menu. We're going to click on the form creator. Again, I talked about how to access these forms in the previous video, so I'm just going to jump in today. I'm going to look at the application forms for the training program area, and there are currently 12. So if I find one, remember we talked about the in use, and let's say this one works, but we have determined that we need to make some edits to this form. So it's very similar to what I need, but I need to maybe delete something or add a whole new section that maybe didn't apply to the previous round or something like that. You can copy across program areas too. So you can take, if you have access to a different program, you can copy a form from that program to your program, or copy a global form to your program if you have access to global. A lot of times this will occur when you have like brand new funding with a brand new program and you're starting from scratch. For taking that case, this form was in use, so I shouldn't manipulate this form. But if I want to take it and create a brand new form, there's a copy button, this orange copy button up here. So I'm going to click copy, and it's going to ask me if I want to change the name. As you can see, it added the word copy to it for me. And then I can determine what program area I want to copy it to. Now this drop down will be the areas you have access to. It's not going to let you copy something to an area that you can't get to. So I have access to global, and I have access to the training program area. And I could copy it right back to the training program area. The important thing to note is that it is now a brand new form, and you can easily identify that because it's not in use. We don't have that check mark. So now that we know it's not in use, it's never been put in a funding opportunity, we can begin manipulating and changing this form. So that's the easier way to create a form. Again, if you have to do some major work on this, it's probably not worth copying it. Okay, so the other way is if you're looking at your form listing, and it doesn't matter what type of form, I just happen to be in an application form view here. It could be a status report form. Make sure you're in the correct area. You can't build one accidentally in the wrong area and then like copy it and make it a status report form if you accidentally build it as an application form. That's just an example. So make sure you're in the right area. So I'm actually building an application form. Up at the top, you can click Add. So if we're clicking Add, we're creating one from scratch. So I'm going to click Add. And really, most of these defaults you're going to leave alone unless it's a special form that you're using in a different way. Like it defaults to standard, and that's what we're talking about today. We're not talking about anything other than a very basic form. And you really need to get comfortable building standard forms before you move on to advanced forms and budget forms. You really have to have this core knowledge first. But it defaults to standard, it defaults to grantee edit and a final application, and typically that's your typical form. It doesn't mean you can't change it. For example, if you have a pre-app process, you can make this a pre-application form. But the majority of forms will follow this standard. And really what you have to do here is give it a form name and a form description. Form description is not required. And as you can see in the instructions, it's very highly recommended that you add a form description. This is truly to help yourself. You want to help yourself. The example I always throw out is if you have, used this system, let's say for 10 years, and over those years you've developed maybe 4 different budgets, and all of them are named budget. The budget, the name of the form, so this form name is what's actually displayed to the user. So the applicant in this case that's using this form would see the form name. They don't ever see the form description. That is truly just for you. So help yourself. You can go back and archive those other 3 old budgets. And then in the form description, you can say, what years or what funding opportunity rounds you used them in. Because when you go to add your forms to the funding opportunity, if you don't clean up your form creator, you're going to have 4 budgets to choose from when you add it to the funding opportunity. And that's how you know which one's which. And you can tell the difference between them. So give yourself a good form description. The next thing I have is the form type. Again, we're going over standard forms. Now, form security, you need to think about. It depends on the type of form you're creating. So in this case, an application form, if I want my applicant to edit this form when their application is in editing, it's grantee edit. And that's what it defaults to. But if you're building a grant form, a grant is an already approved project, right? We've awarded that grant. So most of the time, you don't want the grantee to just go into their grant and just be able to edit the form, especially when you're, think about the budget, things like that, where you've already approved their budget. You wouldn't want them to just come in there and edit and give themselves more money. And that's just an example. So the security you need to think about depending on your form. It's an application form. I want my applicant to be able to edit. So it's grantee edit. But if I was building a grant form, I would probably go with grantor edit only, which means the grantee can see that form. They can see the data in that form when they're in their grant. They can't edit it unless I unlock it for them through negotiation. So that does give them the ability to make corrections if you would negotiate it to them. Now, it's typically a grant form setup. There's also a third option in your security, grantor only or internal only. This is truly an internal form. So if I have a grantor only form, my grantee or my applicant, the external user, they aren't even aware this form exists. It's truly for internal purposes only. They would never see it. There would never be a negotiation allowed on it. Form stage. Again, the instructions say, if it's a pre-app, set it as a pre-app. If not, leave it as final. And it defaults to final. That's, most of our forms are final application forms. Even if you do have a pre-application process, the majority of your forms in the funding opportunity would be final application, and you might have 1 or 2 as the pre-app. I'm going to go through this really quickly and talk about the pre-app. But again, most of them are final applications. With a pre-app, you actually have 3 options to set up a form. And your funding opportunity settings of this form actually trump the form creator. That's really important. So you could have a form set up as a final application form like this, but then you decide you're going to need a pre-application process. You can take a form that's set as a final application form in the form creator, and at your funding opportunity level, you could set it as a pre-app. So if you're using a pre-app process, that's when you get involved with the stage copy. So I'm going to quickly show you the 3 ways to set up a pre-application form, and this is really all about pre-apps. So one is you just have a pre-application form, and then your stage copy is no data doesn't copy. The scenario here is you have offered a pre-application. The applicants have come in and created that pre-application. Any pre-app that is approved at that point would then come in and complete their final application. If you have your form set like this for the pre-app, that pre-application form would go away. It would not be part of the final application process. This is generally not how I see it set up. Typically, you'll want to see the pre-application data that you approved, so you'll also want your form to be set up as a final application form as well. So you'll see it set up as both. And then from there, you have two options. So yes, meaning yes, it's going to copy to the final, but is that data going to be editable or read-only? This is most pre-application forms are set up like this, and I'm going to talk about both of them. So if you have it set to yes, data is editable, that means you're going to have a pre-application process. If approved, that person would come in and complete their final application. At the final application, they will have new forms that they've never completed before, that they'd be just your final application forms, but they would also see that pre-application form that you have already approved. And this setting makes it to where they can change that data. So think about that. You've already approved that pre-application form. You've already approved that data. Do you really want them coming in and changing it after you've approved it? That's what that means. They could change that data. This option is the same scenario. They would see that pre-application form if they were approved for a final. So in their final application, they do see that pre-application form, but they can't change it. You also can't negotiate that form because you've locked it down. Your negotiations on that pre-app need to occur at the pre-application level. Once you have approved that pre-application form would be locked down. They can't change it. They can't make edits. Typically, that's how you want that because you've already approved that. And then they would just come in and complete the rest of their final application. So again, I'm going to go pretty standard, just keep it basic, and just do a final application form. The rest I'm going to leave alone, but I'm going to talk about them. So linked with grant, it says it's currently not linked with the grant, and you wouldn't want to link a form to the grant until it's been tested and approved. That's really important. There's a video that talks about this. It's back in phase 3, preparing for grant tracking, when to link your forms and actually how to do it. The show and review works with this one. They're both defaulted to show in the review for all 5 rounds. And this is pretty typical. If you think about your reviewers reviewing the application, it's basically saying, do you want to show this form that your applicants completed to your reviewers? Most of the time you want your reviewers to see the entire application. So that's why it's defaulted to yes and show in all 5 rounds. In some scenarios, you may have a review that's maybe set up to just maybe review the budget. And if they're just a budget review, you can block them from seeing other forms. So for example, if round 2 isn't supposed to see this form, this isn't the budget, you could say, yes, I want to show it in review, but not for round 2. Generally, that's not the case. And again, the form settings that you set for this form and the funding opportunity trump the form creator. So most of the time you'll leave it like this, and then if you want to make it special for a certain funding opportunity, you can do that at the funding opportunity level. I can't stress this enough. Your funding opportunity controls your forms and trumps all of these settings. Include in template automatically includes this form in every new funding opportunity. This might sound great in the beginning, but after the years go by, you'll have old forms and you don't want them automatically added to every funding opportunity. So if you're going to use this, I want you to really think about it, and you have to be really diligent about going back and cleaning up your form creator. Or 5 years later, you're going to create a funding opportunity and have hundreds of forms be added automatically and then manually be removing them. So it's a really helpful tool if you're going to keep your form creator clean. If not, just don't check it. And then when you create your funding opportunity, you can add your forms and choose which ones you want to add. Eventually, you might archive forms. This is really helpful. This is part of the cleanup I'm talking about. Come back and archive your old forms. There's no harm in archiving a form. It does not remove it from any funding opportunities that it's already in. What it does is it prevents you from adding it to a new funding opportunity. So this is really helpful when you have determined that you have an old form and it's just there to hold data. It's a historical form. You'll archive it. I like to put mine at the bottom of the form listing so they're out of my way. But you can just as easily unarchive a form. So if you did it accidentally or you want to bring it back or something like that, it's just as easy as unchecking the box, and then you can use that form again. So it's just a helpful tool to help you keep the forms clean. And then we have form instructions and help text. Anytime you see a jQuery function, this is a custom functionality that you will not use on the user-defined side of a form. So we're going to talk about form instructions and help text. Form instructions show in a blue box up at the top of a form. I like to put my navigational type instructions, kind of vague instructions up at the top on what that form's all about. You can get deeper with your instructions per section and then even per field. Each field is your questions. So each question can have its own instructions where you would get very detailed on what you're expecting for that particular question. So again, these are going to show up at the top. Help text is nice. Every page has a help button. So I'm going to scroll up and show you the online help. Just remember, the person has to click that button to get whatever text you put in there. So if you get really involved in your help text, you would really have to train your applicants or your grantees to click that button, or they're never going to see the help text that you provided. I prefer to use form instructions because they're provided on the screen at all times. Nobody has to go look for a button or click a button to find it. You can use help text. It is a good tool. Just make sure, your really important instructions are displayed to that user at all times so they don't have to go find a button. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got some form instructions just as an example, and I'm going to put in here. And really all I did, I added some instructions, gave it a good form description and a name. That's it. So now it pops me back into this listing here. And right now, yes, I have a form, but I haven't asked any questions. It's a completely blank form. So I'm going to locate my form. Again, this is why we give it a good form description. Also note that it's not in use. So it's a brand new form that I can manipulate. It's not copied to the grant or anything like that. So I'm going to click on that form and it's blank. So from here, it's really nice to have an example. So sometimes people will, create a Word document or a PDF of, the types of questions they have to ask on their application. And you'll find that a lot of form creation is preference. The way you like things may be different than the way somebody else likes to build their forms. It's not something that's, you have to do it a certain way. Some people like lots of different sections and really long forms with different functionalities, and some people like to break their application up into lots of small forms and different pieces. So it's really, a lot of this goes to preference and what you like and how you're going to train your applicants and things like that. So on my form today, I'm actually going to make a form with different functionality on it. So I'm going to have an edit button and an add button. That's an example of a form that has multiple functionality. I'm going to actually add all 5 sections to my form. And this is where some people go, no, I don't like different functionality on my form. I'm going to put my multi-list, which those are the ones that have the add functionality, maybe on a separate form. And then I'll keep my edit functionality, which are single entries, on a different form. But again, the system is not going to limit you. But if you have different functionalities, make sure you go, test it and get some good form instructions developed up at the top. You can't add attachments and you can't add rows in a multi-list when you're in edit mode. So it is a little more complicated. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to provide some good instructions. Again, the functionality type instructions at the top of your form are really helpful on your form if it's a complicated form. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by adding a section. It's going to be a single value section. A single value is for single entries. It's a good way to remember it. They're going to come in, so the applicant in this case, because it's an application form, is going to come in and click the edit button, enter their data. It'll be single data, singular data, meaning they're not going to add multiples of the same thing. An example would be like a scope of work. We wouldn't ask them for 5 different scopes of work. right? We're just one scope of work entered for the project. That's a single value. So I'm going to click Add New Section. And here I'm going to define my section. So this is my section properties. I'm going to give it a label at a bare minimum. That's all you have to do. You can add some instructions here. The rest is advanced, and we'll cover our advanced stuff. The majority of it will be covered in our advanced form creation training video. So this is like the black header of the section name that will appear to the user. So I'm going to call it my single value example. You can see I've done this before. And my section type is single value. If I just click on this, you can see there's 5 different types of sections. Again, it's good to have an example of what you're building ahead of time and know what you're asking your applicants to really understand the forms and know what kind of data you're asking for. We can control our security here too. So you could have a grantee edit form and then different types of sections. Keep in mind, it's the entire form that gets saved. So that form is tracking who saved it last. So I recommend if you do have an internal only need, for like a section of internal only notes or something like that, that you do create that as a separate form. That way you don't lose your audit trail on who saved this form last. I'm going to leave that defaulted to grantee edit. And then these instructions are section instructions. So they're going to appear right below the section label. And I'm going to add some here so we can see this when we start previewing this. So now I have a section, but I haven't actually asked any questions yet. So if I go put this in a funding opportunity and start testing this, it's still a blank form. There's nothing to put data into. So that's where we're going to start adding our fields. We see this add new field. So I'm going to click add. And you can add many fields to one section. So you can ask multiple questions in one. And again, they would be single entry because we're in a single value. A good example that I see on a lot of applications is a scope of work. You want the scope of work of the project. Your field label, as far as the database is concerned and holding the data, does not matter. So this could be a long paragraph label. It will get scrunched up if you do a long paragraph, but it can be a long label. Now your database field name, it'll tell you it shouldn't have spaces or special characters. This is how the data is actually stored. It's actually the database column name. It's not displayed to the user, but it needs to be short and sweet, not just for the database, for you. You're going to use this in any conditional logic. If you do any contract substitutions, if you do calculations, you're going to use this. You never use the label. You use the database field name. So short and sweet, no special characters or spaces. It'll actually tell you that too. But if you see, I didn't type this. It just took up here and put it down here and removed the spaces for me, which is nice. But if you typed in a whole paragraph up here, you need to come down here and make this short and sweet. Then you choose your data type. The data type depends on what type of data you're asking for. In this case, it's a scope of work, so it's definitely text. There's 5 different types of text boxes. I highly recommend as you're learning, you add all 5 to one of your test forms that you're playing around with and see which one you prefer. Again, a lot of this is preference. So this is going to be a larger text box. The scope of work is generally a bigger box. So I'm going to go text area large. And then, do I want this required? This means if I check this box, it's required for any applicant that's filling out this application form. And generally, I would want every applicant that's submitting an application to be required to enter a scope of work. Now, if you have a question on your form that's conditional, meaning it varies and it's not necessarily required for every applicant, that's when you get into conditional logic, and that is advanced. You cannot require, so this type of require, you can't require a field that's conditionally required. If it's conditional, then it's going to hide sometimes, right? It's not going to be required for certain types of users, and you don't ever want to hide a required field. Okay, so you only require it if it's going to be displayed on the page at all times. It would be read and required for everybody. And then here, if you see the height and the field size, it defaulted based on what I chose up here. So a small box, it changes based on what I'm choosing. So I usually leave my height and my box size alone. But maximum length is your actual character count, and the whole system runs on a character count. You do have to limit the characters. And it's not by words, it's by characters. So they also default to depending on the size box you chose. And I might choose to, with the scope of work, I might want more than 500 characters. I may not. We talked about this in the previous video, but you should not decrease this later. You would be deleting data. You can always increase, so it's better to start small and work up. If you get calls from applicants that they can't get all their data in there, do you want to provide them with more room? If so, then you can come in and increase it, and it's not going to impact the data in the form. I could go ahead and start out with like a 2,500 character count. On my larger boxes, I like to display the character count, so as they type, it actually counts down. I don't do this on all my text boxes. If I'm asking them for a title, something very short, I don't usually display the character count, but I do in my larger boxes. And here you can see that we can control the field security and the view. These are both advanced, and makes it a little complicated when you start messing with these. Generally, you'll leave them to the default. That is all that you have to do. So really pay attention to the red fields, but what I've displayed is all you really have to do to make this question a field and actually be able to save and have it work. And I'm going to quickly scroll through some of the other things just because you'll see it when you're building a form. And it can be overwhelming, so I just wanted to show you the minimum. That's generally all you're going to do to a regular field. But there's also field value properties. There's instructions above each of these, and I highly recommend if you're going to try these out that you read these instructions first. A big part of this too is don't do everything all at once. A lot of them don't work together. You'll use one and not the other. Test it out first. Do one thing, go test, make sure it works. Remember, previewing a form in the form creator is not testing it. You need to put your form in a funding opportunity and actually go test it as the person that would be completing this form. So in this case, it's an application form. So I need to go test it as an applicant. If it was a status report form, I need to go test it as the grantee. You always want to test your form first. But test it out first. Don't sit here and try to add every single one of these. I guarantee it won't work. If you think you want to try a default value, definitely read about it. It's for numbers. I'm working in a text box. Read about it. If you think it's what you need, try it. Go test that one thing. And if it doesn't work, you know what happened. You know what went wrong, and you can go remove it and fix it really easy. Start doing 10 different things at once. You have no idea which one's making it to where the form won't work. This is advanced. So are calculations. Now, if you get into calculations, there's an example here. So you could try out a simple calculation by yourself without having any further training. Definitely test it and make sure it works first. There is a sample here. But if you get into calculations, that's the database field name. And you will only ever use the calculation box. The rest is for custom forms. So you will just use this calculation box here. And then you get into conditional logic, which is again advanced. We'll go over this in our advanced form creation training video. But I wanted to get down to the bottom here. Labels and instructions are not advanced. It does not impact the data of your form, so it's really not a big deal. And a lot of this really is preference. Some people love headers. They show up in a big blue text up at the top above this field, and it's a nice way to separate your different areas of your form. Makes it look pretty. And then you have the field instructions. You have some other things you can try out. I recommend if you're just starting out and you're kind of just playing around in the form creator, creating a field and getting to know, your preferences, try out each one of these. Add a text box and add something in each one of these areas. You'll quickly find out that it's way too busy if you add all of them, but you'll find out which one you like the most. If you love headers or not, if you love field instructions and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and add a header and some field instructions, and I'm going to go ahead and preview this form. So I'm going to click save. There's a save at the bottom too. And again, I'm going to stress previewing the form is just to see if it looks good. It's not how you test a form. You are creating a form, so it's a user-defined form. You can create errors. You can actually break a form. It's a user-defined error if you create an error. It's not a system error. You need to put this form in a funding opportunity and test it before you ever would post your funding opportunity or go live. Make sure your form works. But the preview here is nice. It's not yet in use. It's not in a funding opportunity. And I can see if, I want to change my section name. If I maybe want to move some things around, I can see if it's looking good so far. That's all this preview is meant for. Okay, so now I could continue asking questions in this single value. I'm not limited to just one field here. I could ask more questions, but I'm going to move on and actually add a different type of section now. This section will be a multi-list. This does have different functionality. So I'm going to click Add. The next one in the list here is a multi-list. You may not have a form that has this need for all the different types of sections. But a multi-list allows the applicant, in this case, because it's an application form, to add multiple rows. So we really would be expecting them to enter multiple entries for whatever type of section. So a good example is if we're asking our applicant to list strategies and they're going to have multiples or goals or activities. One applicant might have 3 activities, one might have 5, one might have 2. So they're going to have this add functionality where they can add multiple rows and add multiple goals or activities. And again, that's just an example. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a label here. And I'm just going to call it multi-list example. And then I am going to add some instructions here. And then we're going to talk about the multi-list properties a little bit. Again, most of the properties are advanced, but we have to talk about the multi-list properties. They're unique. So in this type of section, you have to click Add, and then you see all the fields or the questions that you're asking. And those fields, if they're required, the important thing to know about a multi-list is the required fields are only enforced when they click Add. Okay, so they have to click Add, and then those required fields are enforced. This means if they don't click Add, they can skip the entire section. This could be a good thing. So think about like if you're building a budget or something like that and you have multiple categories, so salary, fringe, travel supplies, we'll say, are 4 different multi-list sections, and they might be able to add multiple places they traveled, multiple supplies that they're purchasing, things like that. Well, one applicant may not have any supplies that they're purchasing for their project. So you may want them to skip that multi-list section entirely. But that doesn't mean you don't want the fields required, because if someone does have supplies, when they click Add, you need them to fill out all that information on that supply, how much it costs, how many of them, and so on. So if you want them to be able to skip this section, then you can just leave it as is, require your fields, and put instructions on there and say, don't click Add if this doesn't apply. However, in some multi-list sections, we need this for every project. So for this example, I'm going to make it like goals or activities of the project. Well, I would need that for every applicant. You can actually force them to click Add before they mark it as complete. So that's one of these multi-list properties here, is the minimum records. And it's how many times they're required to click Add before they can mark it as complete. So most of the time, if you just want it required that they add at least 1 entry, you would just put 1. But if you truly need like 3 activities added on every project, you can enforce that they click Add at least 3 times. And then they can't mark this form as complete and submit their application in unless they've added 3 goals in this case. I'm going to just ensure that they click add once. So now I have my multi-list section here, and I'm going to add my fields. So an example here would be like an activity or goal, and they might have many. So I'm going to click add, and I'm going to say description of activity. I'm going to give them a smaller area, and I'm going to require it. Requiring the first field in a multi-list actually gives them the hyperlink to get back in there and edit it. So like if they had a spelling error or something like that, they could go in and change what they typed in there. If you don't require it, then once they click save, they can't edit the row. So that's really important. Again, require the fields in the multi-list that are required. They can skip it if it doesn't apply, if you don't have that minimum record. And that's all I'm going to do. So I want to show you that even though one field has a lot of settings you can do and it can be overwhelming, you don't have to do all of them. So I've just said, give me your description of your activity, and then I'm going to add another field. So I'm going to say, and give me the estimated completion date of that activity. And then that way they could have multiple activities with different dates. I'm going to make this a date box, and I'm going to require their entry. And that's really all I'm going to ask in that section. I'm going to add a third type of section now, and that's a grid. It also opens in edit mode, and it's a single entry, but for many, many rows. So I'm going to click add. I'm going to choose grid. And then I'm going to add some instructions here. I'm just going to call it grid example. The property here, it only has one property. If you see it defaults to row for your first column, I'm going to leave it blank and show you what happens. It's okay to leave it blank, but come back in here. Typically, you'll want a name of that first column, and you can get back into the section properties and do that. So I'm going to click save. And what it looks like here at first, it kind of looks like I have two different sections. But if you look at my single value on my multi-list, it's saying order, field name, label, data type, right? Same with my multi-list, order, field name, label, data type, and so on. I have that same thing for my grid, right? So this first area here is where you actually add the fields, your questions, and then you have this second one for your actual rows. So the one I typically like to use in my example form is like demographic type information. So for my example, I'm going to ask how many people were served. And I'm going to say how many served between a certain age range. And my age range will actually be my rows. So my question, and you can have multiple questions. They end up being the columns in your grid. In this case, I'm just going to have one. But it's going to be how many served. And that would be a number. If you require a field in a grid, that means it's required for every row. And do keep in mind that 0 is a valid entry. So you can see my value range here. If you want them to be forced to enter every single row and above 0, you can enforce that. But keep in mind, like in my example, there may be a case where 0 is truly valid. I didn't serve, a certain age range, so I would accept a 0 in that case. Include totals popped up. It will pop up for number and currency. If you read it, it's when they have multiple entries, so like a multi-list or a grid where there's multiple rows, and it just adds the total at the bottom. Sometimes this is useful, sometimes it's not. In this case, I want to see the total number served, so I will go ahead and include totals and show you what that looks like. And I'm going to click save. Now for my rows, I'm just going to add a few here, but this is going to be my age ranges. So if I want to see how many were served between 0 to 10 years, and I'll just add a couple here. We'll say 11 to 20 years. And then we'll add one more. You could keep going, of course. 21 plus years. What this ends up looking like when I preview it, you have a grid with rows here, And then our question is open, and they could type in their numbers here. And again, they could say, well, I didn't serve any between 11 and 20 and enter a 0, and that would be valid. It's an entry. Now this is that first row there that defaults as row that I was telling you about. You can go back to the section properties. So to get back into your section properties, this is where I originally named it. That's where you get to those properties, and I can say, okay, my first column, I don't want it to say row. In this case, it would be age range. I also want you to know when you go back to a section property of a section you created, what the system did is created a section reference name. It's actually based on the title you gave the section originally, and it's locked down. You can't change this later. So even if you change the label of your section, which is okay to do, it's not going to change your section reference name. I'm pointing this out because you can use these for your calculations. If you want to refer to a section and calculate from that, this is what you actually need. You would need your section reference name exactly as it is, so you would copy this. And then you would need your database building. That's also how you would do your syntax in a contract template if you're working in contract templates ever. And you want to pull this data from this section, that's what you would use. So all I did though really is just add that first column header, and let's see what that looks like. So we've got our single value, our multi-list, and our grid. So that's what our grid looks like, and now I have the age range there. It's looking good. So those are all the sections that hold data, where we're actually asking a question and someone's going to enter data into these forms. You can have multiple sections on the same form, so I could have 5 multi-list if I wanted to. I could have 4 different single values, or I could have 1 single value with many different headers. Again, it's all preference on how you want your form to look. The other 2 types of sections are for attachments only. So I'm going to show you the difference between the 2. They're the easiest sections to create. So I'm going to click Add. I'm going to do Other Attachments first. Other attachments is just an area for many attachments. They're not specified, they're not required. The only time they would ever be required is if you had one other attachment section on your form, and that was the only section on your form, and it was just an attachment form, then it does require at least 1 attachment. But if you throw an attachment section on a form that has other sections, it's actually just going to sit there more like supporting documentations if they need to, but they don't have to upload attachments. It's not actually going to be required. I'm going to add some instructions here, and I'll name it. This is typically, you see this type of section added where it sits alone as just an attachment form. You see this as like supporting documentation and as a claim form, where you have your claim reimbursement form there, they're putting in their expenses this period, and then another form would be an attachment form where they have to upload their receipts and documentation supporting their claim. You see that a lot. You see it in an application like I am, where I'm adding it. It's not necessarily required, but I'm allowing the applicant to give me attachments if they want to. Remember, attachments, it's not actual data that we're asking them to complete and storing that data they've typed in there in the database, which means you can't extract the data in like a report. You do very much still have the attachment and you can see it. It's not going to extract the data that's in that attachment on like a report or something. So most of the time you want to actually build out a form and ask them the questions. So I'm putting in the name of the section and instructions, and when I click save, I am actually done. In fact, you don't even have an area to add a field. You're done. That's the easiest section to create. I don't have to add fields. Now the named attachment's a little bit different. It's where we have something very specific we want them to attach, and you can require specific things. So I'm going to name this my named attachment example. Named attachment here. Add some instructions. Click save. And this one is still pretty easy, but we do have to name specifically what we want them to attach. So I'm going to add In this case, like let's say I want to do a W-9. Every applicant needs a W-9. The benefit of me naming it is I'm naming that you need to give me a W-9. I can also require it where they cannot mark their form as complete until they have uploaded that attachment that I required there. Okay, so what I have now is a form that I am ready to go test, and that is really important. At this point, you need a funding opportunity and test status. You're going to add your forms, and you will actually test the forms as if you're the applicant, if it's an application form. Or in another example, if you're creating status report forms, you need to test them as the grantee. Generally, you'll have a tester type account, not an external account, but a tester account. So you have the privilege to test the forms in a funding opportunity that's in test status. Your external users can't see test status funding opportunities. They see posted. So this means that you get to see your form and test it prior to posting and going live. So I'm going to now go into our funding opportunities. I already have one set up and test. And then I'm going to go to the application tab. So it depends on if you have any forms included in template. You may or may not see forms in the listing here. I don't, so I'm going to actually click the add button and select the forms that I'll be adding. So now I've added my 2 forms. I've got the one that I copied, and then I've got the one I created new. So I'm officially ready to go test this application process, in this case 2 forms. I'm going to actually log out, and I'll log back in as a tester. So now you can see I've logged in as the tester. I've located the funding opportunity that I want to test, and I'm going to go through the wizard and actually create my application. I'll do that really quick. So now you can see I am in my test application. I haven't completed the forms yet, so this is the first view of my application. What you have to know is that the forms automatically open in edit mode the very first time you go into a form. Now, if you've already been in the form and you've left and you come back, it does not open in edit mode. So you can see when I click on this scope of work copy, it opens in edit mode. If I click save, go back and do something else, go back, I have to edit to get into edit mode again. It's important to note that the majority of systems that we set up, we allow the user to save as they go, right? So I can save and not complete this required field. So I can save as I go. That's really important. What I can't do is mark it as complete. It'll tell me I'm missing data. You have to mark all your forms as complete in order to submit. What's really important when you're testing is a proper test is not just sitting out there and editing, making sure you can enter data into your form. A proper test is to make sure you can actually enter data, save it, mark your form as complete, and submit your application. Just the example I used earlier, if you hid a required field, this form will let you save because you can save without completing all required fields. But it's not going to let you mark it as complete. And again, you can create errors in your forms because you're defining the form. So it's very important to test your form properly. And I'm going to go through this slow so you can read the extra stuff. I've got some examples in these instructions that are important, just so you can determine what type of section you need on your form. It's always good to use some decent test data too. If you use keystrokes when you're testing like this, that's not really a proper test. First off, if you don't put spaces in there, it's just going to run your text clear off the page. That's, a person is actually going to come in and type real words with real spaces. So it's really, really best if you have an old application, put some legitimate data in there. It's another way to find out if you've provided enough characters in your forms. Too, if you just use the word test, that's all right to just make sure it's working, but you really should have a decent test of your form before you ever use it live. I want you to notice that this is the different functionalities I was talking about. I am in edit mode, which are my single entries, so my single values and my grids. I can't add an activity to my multi-list. I don't even have the add button in edit mode. That's really important, and this is why some people prefer to put their multi-list on a separate form and actually have like an activities form and name it activities and have that multi-list or mini multi-list sections on that one form, because then they're only dealing with the add functionality. The system doesn't care, so you can do it like I did. Just make sure you have some good form instructions for your applicant, because they can't add in edit mode. So they're going to do all their single entries here. Click Save. And now when I'm in view mode, so I'm not editing, here I can't edit my scope of work. This is where I'll see the add buttons. I'll see them on my multi-list, and also for my attachments, I can add my attachments. If you notice in edit mode, I didn't even see my attachment sections. So again, you'll probably end up with multiple forms in your funding opportunity. You might have, a scope of work form where they're describing the activities or scope or whatever you're asking that are single entry. You might have a goals form where you have your multi-list. You'll always have a budget. So your application may consist of many forms. This is just an example of one. And again, I have lots of functionality going on. This is the check box that I did where I wanted to include the total. You can do that in your currency or your number fields. So that's nice there. That's not a calculation. And now I can add my attachments and add rows. So I'm going to add a couple rows to my multi-list here. And then my attachments down here. I could skip this one, but I do have to do my W-9. Okay, so the important thing to remember is you must test your forms before you go live with them. This is critical. You are creating a form and you can create errors in the form. They're not system errors, they're user-defined errors. You can easily fix them if you test them ahead of time. It's really easy to just go in and fix that mistake, and you can still use that form. This completes our video on standard form creation. Thank you for watching.